Joe. I think at this point I better go home before my reputation gets tarnished. But it's a pleasure to speak here, and I think the fact that so many people showed up means that music is actually a really important part of people's lives. Music's found in every known human society, and people spend a lot of time listening to music, playing music, and also they spend a lot of money and resources on music. So that suggests that music is probably something that's really important to the human species. And so what I'm going to look at a little bit over the next, well, less than an hour, I'm told, is where did music come from? Why do we have music? Where did music come from? And I'm going to explore the idea that music actually evolved from movement. Okay? So that might be a little bit different than the types of evolutionary origins of music you might have heard of before. But this is basically what I'm going to do. I'm going to start by talking about influences of movement on auditory rhythm perception in infants and adults. And this is the idea that not only does music make us want to move, but the way that we move influences how we hear music. And so that, again, suggests that maybe movement is the primary aspect of human behavior here. Then we'll look at effects of experience on this. I'll talk just a little bit about how rhythm is processed in the brain. And then I'm going to end by thinking about, do other species have music? Do other species entrain to rhythmic beats? And if so, what species do and why? Okay, well, the first thing we might notice is that music and dance are intimately connected. Okay? So in some languages, there aren't even different words for music and dance. So again, movement and auditory rhythm seem to be really connected. As far back as we can go in history, we find the same thing. So if you look at ancient Greek writings, you'll find that they modeled music notes on grids, similar to the way we do. And they wrote about movement in space as being analogous to movement of notes in music. In ancient Egypt, they expressed the meaning to sing as a paraphrase to play with the hands. So movement of the hands being somehow analogous to singing. We have all kinds of metaphors describing movement in music. So we talk about speed and timing. Music is slowing down, it's speeding up. We talk about things like andante con moto, which means walking speed with movement. In terms of shape and form in music, we talk about moving from one note to the next. We talk about a phrase tracing an arabesque, which is a dance step. In terms of musical styles, we talk about a flowing melody, a swinging rhythm. So certainly, we have this metaphoric idea that there's something similar between auditory rhythms in music and how we move. But the question I want to explore is it more than just a metaphor? Are there actually direct connections between movement and auditory rhythm? And did perhaps movement evolve first and music developed out of movement? So that's the basic idea. So if we start to think then about rhythmic movement, so forget about the auditory system now, just think about rhythmic movement. It turns out it's not that difficult to build a neural circuit that will execute rhythmic movement. So if you go to the primitive jellyfish, you might argue a jellyfish doesn't even have a brain. It has some neurons, but it probably doesn't have enough in a conglomerate to say it has a brain. But yet a jellyfish is able to execute very beautiful rhythmic movement. So we tend to see jellyfish washed up on the shore where they're not so beautiful. But if you see them swimming in the water, it's actually, they locomote through this rhythmic movement. And so people have studied the circuits of how a group of neurons can execute rhythmic movement. Well, what about sound? Okay, if we go to a somewhat more sophisticated animal, the spider, we find that here we actually get some kind of integration between sound and movement. So this is from Dr. Ron Hoy at Cornell University, who's a biologist, and he studies how insects communicate through sound. And this is a recording of one of his test subjects. This is actually a spider. What you can see here, this is a male spider, and he'll do a dance, a mating dance. This is the female spider, and she's not moving. She's actually pinned in place because she has a nasty habit of eating the male during this ritual, and so in order to save his males from that end, she's not allowed to move. But what I want you to look at here is the integration of the sound and the movement, and ask yourself whether this reminds you of any human behaviors that you've seen. So it might remind you of some human dances. There seem to be some similarities, even though in evolutionary terms we're so distant from spiders. So the basic question then here is there a common central temporal pattern generator? So some circuit in the brain, say of humans, we're interested in the end, for rhythmic movement and for auditory perception. So would there be some common place in the brain that would do both of these functions? And it's informative to look again at another insect species here. If we look at crickets, so crickets, the males make sound by movement of their wings, and the central pattern generator in the brain that does that is quite well studied. We know really in detail how it works. What the interesting thing here from our perspective is that if you look at the females, they don't make any sound, but they have a very similar pattern generator in their brain. And what their pattern generator looks at is the sound coming in, because their job in the wild is to listen for the sound of the males and then find the males in order to mate. Okay? So they have to be able to distinguish the particular rhythm of their own species. So for instance, here's one cricket species.
Snowy tree cricket.
And here's another species.
Tinkling ground cricket, Alamobius tenuis.
Okay, so the cricket, the female cricket has to distinguish the right pattern, identify the right pattern so she can find the males to mate. But the interesting thing is that the two, male and female, have a very similar pattern generator in their brain, but one of them uses it to create the sounds, the other uses it to perceive the sound. So we have, again, this connection between the auditory and the motor. So in humans, do we also have a common part of the brain that does both of these functions? And just to start thinking about this, maybe we do. There's certainly similarity in the rate at which we locomote, the rate at which we walk, and the optimal tempo for music in terms of being able to discriminate, being most sensitive to differences in tempo. People readily produce movements in time to music. I don't have to tell you that. I'm sure that you've all experienced this. You listen to music, you want to move. In the lab, people do tapping studies, and it's very easy to get people to produce rhythmic movements in time to music. I'll talk a little bit later about some brain studies, but just in general, brain regions that are responsible for synchronized movement, if you just present an auditory rhythm to them, they will light up in an MRI study. So just hearing a sound activates in your brain areas that are responsible for rhythmic movement. Okay? So again, suggesting that there's some kind of direct connections here. And in terms of pedagogy, educational methods such as Dalcroze have taught for a long time that when we're learning to produce rhythms as a musician, we can't do it unless we feel them in our body. Okay, that we have to feel the rhythm first in our body, and then we're able to produce the rhythms. Okay, so there's a long-standing educational tradition that also suggests there's this direct connection there between auditory and motor system. Okay, so did musical rhythm evolve from movement? Well, in order to study this, one thing that we have to think about is what's called beat induction. So if I play you a rhythm, I can play you a fast rhythm, or I can play you a slow rhythm, and you will extract a steady beat. So I can play 8th notes, 16th notes, and so on. You will be able to extract from that a steady beat. Okay? That beat may not be actually in the stimulus directly itself, but your brain extracts that regular beat. Okay, so you can tap your foot to it. Sometimes you'll tap your foot and there's no sound there, but you know it's a beat. You know it's a beat from just the structure of the whole rhythm that I'm presenting to you. So it's your brain that extracts this regularity, this regular beat, and you can tap along to it. Evolutionarily, it's probably the most fundamental thing that had to be in place in order for us to develop music. And so before I can talk to you about some of the studies that we've done, I just need to make this distinction between two aspects of temporal structure in music, what we call grouping and what we call meter or metric structure. So the grouping you can think of, that's like a phrase. So if I was to play for you Amazing Grace, the first phrase would be Amazing Grace, and the second phrase would be How Sweet the Sound. So these are the phrases. But the metric structure, the rhythmic extraction, this beat extraction that I was talking about, doesn't have to completely line up with the phrasing structure. So what it does is it gives you a series of strong and weak beats. So we have beats here, amazing grace, how sweet the sound. But every third beat is like a stronger beat. Okay? And so we have this hierarchy of beats that forms the metrical structure. And it's this metrical structure that I'm going to focus on for the rest of the talk. So we can rephrase our question as, does metrical processing originate in music? And I'm going to show you a series of experiments where we looked at, does how we move affect our interpretation of an auditory meter? And does this happen also really young, like in infants? So how are we going to do this? Well, let me start by playing you what we would call an ambiguous rhythm. So if I had a 6-beat pattern, and I just repeat it over and over again, you could hear it in one of two ways. You could hear it as having strong beats every third beat, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Or you could hear it as having strong beats every second beat, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we say this is like a waltz, this is like a march. And you can hear a rhythm one way, or you can hear it the other way. And it's a little bit like an ambiguous visual display. So if you look at this, what do you see? Do you see a black vase? Or do you see two white faces? Okay, so you can switch back and forth. You can see one, or you can see the other. So we call that an ambiguous figure. Your brain can interpret it in one of two ways. Same with this 6-beat pattern. Your brain can interpret it as this, or it can interpret it as this. Okay? And just to give you an example, in West Side Story, Leonard Bernstein wrote the piece, I Like to Be in America, and it switches back and forth from this rhythm to this rhythm every bar. Okay, so I'll just play a little bit of that, see if you can hear that. One, two, three, 1, 2, 2, 3, 1, 2, 2, 3, 1, 2. Did you hear that? That goes back and forth. Okay? So we built on that idea. Our patterns aren't nearly so interesting because we wanted to control so many things in the lab. But we built a little pattern. And I have two versions of it. So here's one version. here's the other version. Now it turns out both of those patterns have the same notes in them, the same duration of beats, but the accents are different. So in the first one, we accented every third beat, and in the second version, we accented every second beat. Okay, so this is really crucial to all the experiments that are coming, that you got that. Now we can play it in its ambiguous form without any accents. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to play this ambiguous rhythm to an adult, many adults actually, and this is the experimenter and this is one of the participants. The participant is holding the experimenter's hands and they're bouncing. Half of them are going to bounce on every second beat and half of them are going to bounce on every third beat. Okay, so through the movement, we're going to induce a feeling of a waltz in half the subjects and we're going to induce a feeling of a march in the other half of the subjects. Okay? But they're all going to hear the same thing. Okay, they're going to hear this rhythm with no accents, but we're going to move them in two different ways. And then we're going to ask, did they hear different things? Okay? So what we do after they do the bouncing is we play for them the two versions. The one version now that has accents every second beat, the other version has accents every third beat, no more movement. And we just say, which one of these is what you heard while you were doing the movement? And if we bounce them on every second beat, they told us that what they heard was the version with accents every second beat. And if we bounce them every third beat, they told us that they heard the version with accents every third beat. They all heard the same thing, right? We presented them the same sounds, but the way that we bounced them made them hear it as either a waltz or hear it as a march. Okay, so what we've shown then is that movement, the way you move, actually affects how you hear, how you perceive rhythmic patterns. We did some control conditions. I'm going to skip through some of this. The one thing that's interesting is that you don't have to be able to see to do this. So when you move up and down the visual, scene moves, the objects, some objects move with you, some don't. But you don't need visual information. You get the same result if you're blindfolded. However, if you sit and don't move yourself and you watch someone else bounce, okay, so you watch someone else move on every second beat or on every third beat, then we don't get the effect. So this effect seems to be necessary for you to move yourself in order to get this effect. Okay, so there's something about the movement itself. So the next question we asked was, how early in development did these multisensory connections occur? We were hypothesizing that if this is something really fundamental to music, we should see these connections early on. And in fact, across cultures, infants experience concurrent movement and singing basically every day of their life. Okay, so they're rocked to sleep at night. When they're held, they hear their mother's footsteps at the same time that they're experiencing the movement as she walks. So they're getting this concurrent input all the time from the auditory and the movement senses. So the babies, we have two problems. First of all, they can't move themselves, so we have to move them. And the second problem is we can't ask them what they heard, so we have to come up with some way of testing what did they perceive when they heard something. So the first question is easier to solve, and basically we can just hold them and move them. And so we did the same experiment with babies. So here's one of my graduate students, Jessica Phillips Silver, former graduate students. She's now gone on to University of Montreal. So here she is bouncing an infant on every third beat of that rhythm pattern. And just as an aside, the babies love to be bounced, right? I mean, all of us who have children know this, right? We just automatically move babies, bounce them, and so on. They love this stimulation. So this was actually one of the nicest studies to run in my lab, because we didn't bore them with sounds over and over and over again that they didn't really want to listen to or anything like that. They got movement, which they loved. Okay, here's, she's bouncing the same baby, but in the real experiment, we bounce different groups of infants in the two conditions. But here she is bouncing on every second beat. So the auditory stimulus is exactly the same. It's only the movement that's different. Okay. So how are we going to ask babies what they perceived when they heard that? Well, in this case, we use what's called a preference paradigm. So we're going to see which pattern infants prefer to listen to. So remember, they got the ambiguous pattern with no accents, but we want to know, did they perceive it this way or did they perceive it this way? And so we're going to, on half of the trials, give them this pattern, and on half the trials, we'll give them this pattern. And we'll let them listen as long as they want on every trial. And basically how that works is the experimenter, well, first of all, I should say the experimenter wears headphones, as does the parent, so they don't know what the baby's hearing at any particular time. The baby sits on the mom's lap, and then we'll flash a light, say over on this side, we'll flash a light until the baby looks. When the baby looks, that light will stay on, and we'll play one of these patterns for them. Say we'll play this pattern for them. As long as they look at that light, they'll get to hear the pattern. When they look away, the light goes off and the pattern stops playing. So they learn very quickly after 1 or 2 trials of this that they control turning off the pattern. And then on the other side, we'll flash a light. When the baby looks, the light will stay on, and we'll play the other pattern, say this one. Again, as long as the baby looks, they get to hear that pattern. When they look away, it stops. So they control how long they listen, and then we'll give them about 20 trials of this, and we'll be able to tell what pattern do they prefer to listen to. And here we're capitalizing on the fact that they will listen longer to the pattern that they were familiarized with than the one that they were not familiarized with. And so, in fact, that's what we find. So if they were bounced during training on every second beat, then during this listening test, they looked longer in order to hear the pattern with accents every second beat. If they were bounced on every third beat during the training, then in this listening test, they looked longer in order to hear the pattern with accents every third beat. So this tells us then, because they all heard the same thing, it tells us that the way that they were moved, again, affected how they heard the pattern. Okay, so again, even in young infants, we're finding that there is this strong influence of how you move on what you hear. Again, for babies, they don't need visual cues in order to do this, and I have to admit, they weren't happy about wearing. This baby is smiling, but they weren't all smiling during that. But nonetheless, they did still give us the same results. So they don't need to see in order to be able to do this. However, just like the adults, even though they were quite attentive in watching the experimenter bounce, it had no influence on their preferences afterwards. Okay? So if we didn't actually bounce them, if they just watched someone bouncing, it didn't have the same influence. Okay? So they had to actually move in order for us to see these results. Okay, so what is the nature of this interaction between movement and hearing? In infants, we moved them passively, so they didn't actually generate any motor programs to do the movement themselves. We just moved them. Would that be true for adults too? Because the adults moved themselves, so the adults had to generate in their brain a motor program to bounce up and down. So we did a series of studies with adults. We didn't have anybody in the lab who was strong enough to pick up our adults and move them up and down. So we used, we built a little seesaw. And so people got to lie down. Undergraduates loved this because they could come in and have a bit of a nap. And the seesaw moves around a fulcrum about here. So you bounce, you move up and down like this. Okay? And then we just move them up and down either on every second beat or on every third beat of the pattern, and found the same thing. So even though they were just passively sitting there, lying there with no active motor programming going on, we still get the transfer effect. Okay? So this led us to think about, in a little bit more detail, what is it about the movement that is critical in this? So there's a lot of aspects of the motor system. There's motor planning, so there's figuring out what muscles you want to move and innervating those muscles and getting them to move. But there's also proprioception involved. So if you close your eyes and you move your hand in space, you know where your hand is even though you can't see it. That's one aspect of proprioception. We know from muscle tension and so on in a gravitational field what it feels like to have our limb in certain positions. One big aspect of the vestibular, one big aspect of proprioception is the vestibular system. The vestibular system is the organ that gives you your sense of balance. It's located in the ear, in the semicircular canals, but it's separate from the auditory part of the ear. Okay? And every time you move your head, so if you move your head back and forth, up and down, side to side, the vestibular system is activated. So the little hair cells in the semicircular canals send signals through the vestibular nerve up to the brain that say, we've moved, okay? The head is moved. So basically when you walk through space and you have the sensation that you're moving, it's all happening from the head movement, from the organ in your ear, the vestibular organ in your ear. So why are we interested in vestibular? Well, first of all, it's evolutionarily very ancient. So it was there, right from the beginning. It turns out, well, not right from the beginning, but early on, it turns out that knowing where you are in the gravitational field is really a prerequisite for being able to locomote from one thing to the next. So to be able to catch prey or do almost anything, you have to know where you are in the gravitational field. So the vestibular system is ancient. It also develops really early. So infants, long before they're born, they have a sense of where they are in the gravitational field. So we thought maybe the vestibular system might be really important for this interaction between auditory and movement. So our first studies on this, we just made use of our seesaw, and we reasoned that for the vestibular system to be activated, the head has to move. So if we just move people's feet on every second beat or on every third beat, and their head is stationary, then we shouldn't get the effect. We shouldn't get this transfer, and in fact, we don't. So if we just move their head on every second beat or on every third beat, and we ask them afterwards, which pattern did you hear? They're not biased to hear one pattern or the other. So moving the feet doesn't seem to be a very effective way of getting this transfer. On the other hand, if we keep the feet still and we move the head by putting the head on our little seesaw, then the effect is reduced, but we still do get a difference. We still do see an influence of the movement on how you're interpreting the rhythm. So we decided to test this a little bit more directly. And it turns out that the vestibular nerve, unlike the auditory nerve, the vestibular nerve comes very close to the surface of the skin behind your ear. And so we can put a little electrode behind your ear and give you a little bit of an electric current there, tiny, tiny current, that actually stimulates the vestibular nerve. So we can stimulate the vestibular nerve directly and see whether that's going to influence how you hear things. Okay? And so it turns out, after some experimentation, we found that if we stimulated the left and right ears out of phase, so you're stimulating one and then the other and then one and then the other, sort of behind the ear here, you have the sensation, it's very strange, your head is actually not moving, but because we're stimulating the vestibular nerve, It's sending information to your brain saying that the head moved, and you have the feeling that your head is moving back and forth like this, but your head's actually stationary. Okay, so we're fooling the system. We're stimulating the vestibular nerve, giving it information that your head's moving like this, when actually there's no movement. So here we have no movement involved at all, but for half of the subjects, we stimulate the vestibular nerve so you feel like it's moving on every second beat. And for the other half of the subjects, we stimulate the vestibular nerve so you feel like it's moving on every third beat. And the question is, will this lead to, will this influence how you hear the pattern? And the answer is yes. So if you were stimulated in duple time, you tell us that you heard a waltz. If you were stimulated in triple time, you tell us that you heard a waltz. Did I get that wrong? Here you heard a march, here you heard a waltz. Okay? Control condition, we stimulated the elbows because you do get a little bit of a prickling sensation, and we thought maybe that was enough to do it. So we stimulate the elbows exactly the same way, alternating one then the other, and there's no significant effect of doing that. So it seems then that the vestibular input alone is enough to drive this interaction between movement and hearing. So what I want to do next is just really briefly tell you about one experiment where we looked at infants, and we looked at, is this influenced by experience? Is this something that's just built in, or is it actually affected by how you experience sounds in the world? And that's important because if it's affected by experience, then it's modifiable. So we went into a class of kinder music. I don't know if you're familiar with this. It's a class for mums and babies, or dads and babies. And so in the kinder music class, they get a lot of experience with moving to music. So the parents bounce the babies, they tap rhythms on them, they do all kinds of movement and music sort of exercises. And so we figured that maybe we could see an influence of that on the infant's behavior. So it turns out that in Western music, we are much more prone to write music that's in duple time, like waltz march time, than we are to write music that's in waltz time. So it's about 70% of music is written in 2/4/4/4 time signatures, and that was reflected in the songs that they used in the kinder music class. And so we ran exactly the same study with bouncing the babies who had had this kinder music experience, and we found the same effects. But what was interesting here, and unlike the infants who had not had this training, is that these infants were exposed to a lot of duple training, and they showed the effect much more strongly for duple than they did for the triple waltz rhythm. Okay, so that tells us that the experience they're having in that infant class is shaping how these connections are developing between movement systems and auditory system. And that's really important because most, well, for many things, but even just within music itself, most of us think that, well, you know, you shouldn't really start music training maybe till you're 6 years old, or maybe older, depending on what instrument you're learning. But what this is telling us is that if you expose infants to a lot of march rhythms, their brains are going to get really good at march rhythms. And later on, if you try to teach them waltz rhythms, you might have trouble. And in fact, that's the overwhelming finding of music teachers anywhere that you talk to is, oh, kids have real trouble with waltz rhythms. Right? It's probably because it's not that they were bad at it early on, it's that they didn't have as much exposure to it as to duple rhythms early on. And so if you extrapolate that and you think about, well, you know, really we want them to be able to do complex rhythms, maybe rhythms in 5, groups of 5 or groups of 7, we should probably be exposing them to those in infancy to make it maximally easy for them to learn it later on. If we don't expose them in infancy and their brain gets set up to be really good at processing, say, duple rhythms, it's going to be harder for them to learn those complex rhythms later on. So there are some, I think, really interesting pedagogical conclusions that you can come to from these kinds of studies. Okay, but in general, we can conclude that enriched experience with movement accelerates enculturation to the metrical structures that are prevalent in your culture, which in our culture is these duple rhythms. not true across different cultures. Okay, how is meter processed in the nervous system? How does your brain process musical rhythms, and is it related to the motor system? Well, as I said, I think near the beginning, a number of recent studies indicate that there are interactions between auditory and motor systems. And one interesting area is the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia is the area that's sort of hit first in Parkinson's disease. And Parkinson's patients, as you probably know, have trouble initiating movement. So they have trouble walking because they have trouble initiating the movement to walk. If you put them on a bicycle and once they start, they can ride forever because you don't have to initiate a movement. It's a smooth movement when you ride a bicycle. But if they have to initiate a movement in walking, that's very difficult. It turns out that the basal ganglia are one of the areas that's activated just by listening to musical rhythms. So if you give Parkinson's patients just a metronome beat, you can give them music too, but if you just give them a metronome beat, their walking improves immediately. It's not even, it requires some training. It's an immediate effect. And we think that's because when you present the auditory rhythm, it's activating the motor system. It's giving them that extra input to their motor system, which isn't functioning very well. And it's enabling them to do movements that otherwise they would find difficult. So because of that finding that Parkinson's patients were better able to move when they heard auditory rhythms, we've been doing quite a few studies looking at how in the human brain the motor system and auditory system are related. And I'll just give you a flavor of some of these studies. So in this case, we just presented what we call isochronous rhythms, so just simple beats, evenly spaced, but at different tempos, a fast tempo, a medium tempo, a slow tempo, and then just randomly. Okay? And in this particular study, we used MEG, magnetoencephalography. You're probably familiar with EEG, because you may have even had a diagnostic EEG test or something when you were in the hospital. MEG, what it does is it measures magnetic fields that are set up by depolarizing of neurons in your brain. And if you get enough of these neurons firing at the same time, then it creates a magnetic field that's big enough that we can measure it at the surface of the head. Okay? And this is, in this case, it's a child, but we measure adults as well using this MEG facility. So what kind of data do you get from MEG? Well, it's similar to the kind of data you can get from EEG. And what's shown here is, remember I showed you we're presenting those beats. So we're looking at the brain's response to those beats, just beat after beat. This is the onset of one of the beats, and this is 1 second of time. So this is brain activity over that time. In this particular plot, what's shown on the y-axis is the amount of energy at different frequencies. So have you all heard of alpha bands? You know, you have alpha activity, you're falling asleep, beta activity, gamma. I don't know if those mean anything to you. Most people have heard of alpha activity as being associated with sleep. These are brain oscillations. So think activity that's going on in neural circuits in the brain at different frequencies. So the low frequencies are here, the high frequencies are here. And the color scheme here is the positivities are, the reds are positivity and the blues are negativity. So you're getting this increase, decrease, increase, decrease, increase, decrease in activation patterns. And you see two of them, right? So you see this one here around 20 hertz. And you see this one here in the really fast oscillations around 60 hertz. Okay, this one is called the beta band, and it's just plotted out here. So you get an increase, decrease, increase, decrease. And the interesting thing about it is here's where the beats occur. It's following the tempo of the beats. So here we have a signature in the brain that's following the rhythm that we're presenting to you. So as we slow down, these get spaced out in time. And as we slow down even further, they get spaced out even further. Okay? We also have oscillations going on in the fast regions, and they're of a different type. They're these spiky things that occur right after the onset of the beat. And we think that these ones are important. These ones actually trigger these slower oscillations. Okay? So this is from auditory cortex. So we have a measure now in auditory cortex of this oscillatory activity that we're inducing by presenting people with rhythms. And then the really interesting thing is that if we look across the whole brain and we look where in the brain do we have this correlated activity going on, we have it not only in auditory areas, but we have it in motor areas like the supplementary motor area and in the cerebellum, which is known as a movement organizing structure in the brain. So when we present these auditory rhythms, we have this whole network having to do with movement and hearing that's activated. Okay, and that research is, I think, really important because it's going to help us understand things like Parkinson's patients and other motor disorders that we can perhaps rehabilitate with auditory training. Okay, I'm just going to really briefly end by talking about other species. Sort of like I started out with other species, I'm going to go back to other species. It turns out that not very many species can do what we can do in terms of entraining to a beat. So if I play a rhythm and it's a fast rhythm, you can go along with me and clap or dance to a fast rhythm. If I slow down, you can slow down with me and train to a slow rhythm. Those crickets I was telling you about, they can't do that. They're stuck at one pattern. Okay? They have a hardwired pattern in their brain, and that's all they can do. But as humans, we're really flexible. We can entrain to lots of different tempos. Turns out there's only a few species that also can do that. There's some cockatoos, African gray parrots, elephants, seals. And if you look across all of these species, the thing that they all have in common is that they're vocal learners. Okay? So they'll imitate. So parrots will imitate. They can listen to sounds and then repeat them back. Okay? Turns out elephants can do that too. Seals can do that. And all of the species that have been found who can do entrainment to a beat are species that can do vocal learning. So this ability to entrain to a beat is important not only for music, but it's probably the whole foundation of language. Okay? Because if you can't entrain to a beat, you can't learn to produce sounds that you hear, and you can't learn a language. Okay? So this thing that we're talking about that sort of goes back to the jellyfish and the movement that the jellyfish makes, we can sort of trace it through music and language and into these higher functions that we have as humans. So in case you haven't seen this, this is one of the cockatoos that Annie Patel has been studying, the rhythmic behavior of this bird. And this is just a clip of this bird in training to some music. question is taste in music, but that bird dances better than some people that I know. Okay, here's some take-home messages in case you fell asleep partway through. First one, how we move affects how we perceive musical rhythms. Auditory motor connections are affected by experience in infants, and probably later on, although we haven't studied that. Simply listening to a rhythm activates cortical and subcortical motor regions. And only species that do vocal imitation and train to rhythmic beats. So it's an important thing for language as well as for music. So the really shorter, even shorter take-home message, the origins of musical rhythm are likely in movement, and the ability to entrain to a rhythm is likely necessary for the emergence of human language and social interaction. Here's some of the main people that worked on this. Jessica was a graduate student who's now at University of Montreal. Lawrence Harris worked on the vestibular studies. He's at York University. Xiaoxing has just graduated, right, from the Vision Lab here at McMaster. Jingjiang Li was our technician at the time, and David Gary is a PhD candidate and also teaches in the School of the Arts. So just to leave you, I'm going to play an excerpt of Mahalia Jackson singing Amazing Grace. And I just do this because I've been telling you all about these regular beats and how the brain encodes to regular beats and all this stuff. And we all know Amazing Grace. We know where the beats are in Amazing Grace. She takes such complete liberties and distorts the rhythm so completely that it's amazing we hear where the beats are at all. And yet we do. And I just want to play this to have you think about how incredibly flexible our brain is in terms of hearing musical rhythms, that we can actually follow the rhythm in something like this. So listen here in particular. See how she distorts the rhythm? And yet you still know where the downbeats are.
Amazing grace.
for a long time. But you get the idea that we can completely distort rhythms if we're familiar with the piece in particular, and you'll still understand. You'll still know where those downbeats are. Okay, well, thank you very much.